The first time I remember standing at that stove instead of sitting at that table, I was 24 years old and newly married, and I thought I was being kind. I did not know I was setting a precedent. I want to start you somewhere else, though. Somewhere further down the road, because that's where this story actually begins in my mind. It begins on a Sunday in March, at my mother-in-law's birthday dinner, with a wooden serving spoon still warm in my hand, and the sound of my own palm connecting with an old woman's face echoing off the dining room walls. My daughter was crying. My son had gone still in that particular way children go still when they're trying to memorize something so they can understand it later. And I remember thinking, very clearly, in the middle of all that noise, this is the last dinner I am ever serving in this house. But to understand how a person gets there, how a decade of quiet, agreeable, at-your-service marriage ends with a slap across a birthday table, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when I still thought love meant making yourself small enough to fit into someone else's tradition. My name is Marin. I teach art to 3rd and 4th graders, which means I spend my days covered in tempera paint and glitter glue, gently reminding 8-year-olds not to eat the clay. I am, by nature, a peacemaker. Ask anyone who knew me growing up and they'll tell you the same thing. Marin doesn't like conflict. Marin smooths things over. Marin would rather eat a cold dinner than make someone else uncomfortable. That instinct, the one that made me a good teacher, is also, I think now, the exact thing that let 10 years pass before I noticed what was happening to me. I married Julian when I was 24. He is quiet in the way engineers often are, more comfortable with blueprints than feelings, but steady and kind in the specific way that made me feel safe rather than swept off my feet. I liked that about him. I still do, honestly, even now, even after everything. He was raised by his mother alone from the time he was 9, after his father left, and Delphine, his mother, had spent those years building a household that ran exactly the way she needed it to run, in order to feel like she hadn't lost control of everything else in her life. I understood that at first. I even admired it. Delphine had been a hospital administrator for 30 years, the kind of woman who could organize a wing of a building through sheer force of will, and when I met her, I thought, this is a strong woman, and I want her to like me. So when, at our very first Thanksgiving as a married couple, she handed me a serving spoon and said, "You don't mind, do you?" I've always found the young ones enjoy helping. I didn't mind. I took the spoon. I filled her plate first, then Julian's, then his cousin's, then sat down last, after everyone had already started eating, and told myself it was just one dinner. Just one gesture. Just kindness. It was not just one dinner. It became the rule. Nobody ever announced it as a rule. That's the thing about families like Julian's. Nothing is ever said outright, because saying it outright would mean someone would have to take responsibility for it. Instead, it just became true. The way water finds the lowest point in a room without anyone deciding it should. Every Sunday dinner, every birthday, every holiday. I cooked, or I helped cook, and then I served. Delphine first, always, then Julian, then whoever else was at the table that week, and by the time I sat down, my food was lukewarm and the conversation had moved on without me, and I ate quickly so I could get up again for the next thing someone needed. Julian never told me to do this. I want to be fair about that, because fairness matters to me even now. He never once said, "Marin, go make my mother's plate." But he also never once said, "Mom, Marin should sit down and eat with the rest of us." He just let the current carry things the way they'd always been carried, because noticing it would have meant swimming against his mother. And Julian did not swim against his mother. Not for anything. Not for 10 years. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from being useful in a way nobody thanks you for, because they've stopped seeing it as a choice you're making. It stops registering as generosity. It just becomes what you're for. I remember the year our son Noah was born. I hosted Christmas dinner 4 days after coming home from the hospital, because Delphine mentioned, almost offhand, that she hated to see tradition slip just because of a baby. I stood at that stove with stitches still healing, Noah asleep in a bassinet in the next room, and I made a 12-pound turkey, and when I finally sat down to eat, Delphine was already asking Priya, Julian's sister-in-law, married to his stepbrother, whether she wanted more stuffing, because I hadn't gotten to it yet. Priya. I should tell you about Priya, because she matters to this story, even though for years she had no idea she was part of the problem. Priya married into the family 2 years after I did, and from the moment she arrived, she occupied a completely different seat at that table. Not literally, but in every way that counted. Delphine adored her instantly. Priya was polished, quick with a compliment, worked in marketing and always had some clever, charming thing to say. And Delphine treated her the way you'd treat a guest you were trying to impress, rather than a family member you'd absorbed. Priya never served a single dish in that house. She sat down when she arrived, and she stayed sitting until she left. And I don't think it ever once occurred to her that this was strange, because nobody had ever shown her the alternative. She simply never saw the kitchen the way I saw it, as a place I disappeared into so everyone else's evening could run smoothly. I don't blame Priya for that. Not really. Not anymore. But I'm telling you now so that later, when I tell you what she did, and what she didn't do, you'll understand why it mattered so much. For 10 years, I told myself a story about all of this. The story went, this is just how Delphine is. This is just tradition. This is just being a good daughter-in-law. It doesn't cost me that much. I told myself that story through 2 pregnancies, through moving Delphine into a smaller house when she downsized, through 100 Sunday dinners where I ate standing at the counter because there wasn't a clean seat left by the time I sat down. I told myself that story right up until the night I stopped being able to. It was Delphine's 63rd birthday. I'd spent the whole day on it, a beef bourguignon because it was her favorite, a lemon cake from scratch because she didn't trust bakery frosting, the good tablecloth ironed and laid out by 4 in the afternoon. Noah was 8 by then, Ivy 5, and they'd both helped me set the table, proud of themselves. Ivy insisting on folding the napkins into little triangles even though they came out crooked every time. By the time everyone arrived, Julian, Delphine, Priya, and her husband, I'd been on my feet for 6 hours. I plated Delphine's dinner first, the way I always did, then Julian's, then Priya's, then her husband's, and then, because Ivy was tugging at my sleeve saying she was hungry, and Noah's stomach was audibly growling, and my own hands were shaking slightly from low blood sugar, I picked up my own plate from the stove and served myself before I brought Delphine back to the table for her second helping of cake, which she'd asked for the moment I sat down. I want you to understand. I sat down for maybe 40 seconds. That's all it took. 40 seconds of eating my own dinner before attending to a request. Delphine stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor, she said, and I remember this exactly, because I've replayed it more times than I can count. She said, "You have never understood your place in this family, have you?" And then she slapped me. Open palm, across the face, hard enough that I felt it in my teeth. Hard enough that Ivy screamed. The room went completely silent except for my daughter crying, and my son staring at his grandmother with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between confusion and betrayal. Like the floor of the world had just tilted 6 inches to the left. I looked at Julian. I want to tell you, he stood up. I want to tell you he said something. He didn't. He sat there, hands flat on the table, staring at his mother like he was waiting for someone else to fix what had just happened. Something in me, 10 years of something in me, just stopped being quiet. I set down the serving spoon. I looked at Delphine and I slapped her back. Once. Not wild, not screaming. I want to be honest with you about that, because I've thought hard about whether that moment makes me the villain of my own story, and I've decided I don't care anymore whether it does. It wasn't rage. It was the sound of 10 years finally landing somewhere. Then I turned to my children and said, "Get your shoes. Nobody stopped me." I think that's the part that still surprises me, even now. Not the slap, not the silence, but how easily I walked out of a house I'd spent a decade making myself indispensable to, and how nobody moved to keep me there. Noah found his sneakers by the door in about 10 seconds flat, like some part of him had been ready to leave for longer than I realized. Ivy was still crying, and I picked her up, one shoe on and one shoe dangling from my hand, and I didn't look back at the table before I walked out. Julian followed me to the car. I'll give him that much. He did follow me. He stood in the driveway in the cold without a jacket, and he said my name twice, and when I finally turned around he said, "Marin, you can't just," and then he stopped, because I think even he heard how that sentence was going to end, and he didn't want to be the man who finished it. "I can't just what, Julian?" I said. "Leave? Or hit her back?" He didn't answer. That was answer enough. I drove to my sister's house that night with the kids buckled in the back. Ivy eventually crying herself to sleep somewhere around the highway exit. Noah quiet and watchful in the rearview mirror the whole way, like he was standing guard over something. I didn't cry until they were both asleep on my sister's pull-out couch. Then I sat on her kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I cried the kind of crying that comes from somewhere much older than one dinner. I texted Julian just one line before I turned my phone off for the night. "I'll talk when you're ready to actually see what happened tonight." I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after, because the leaving wasn't the end of the story. It was just the part where the story stopped being only mine. Julian called the next morning, and the morning after that, and I let most of those calls go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't trust myself to have that conversation yet. When I finally did pick up, 4 days later, he didn't lead with an apology. He led with, My mother says you attacked her. I remember sitting very still with the phone against my ear, and something in me, some old, tired, accommodating part of me, wanted to explain myself, to make him understand the 40 seconds and the 10 years and the shaking hands and the low blood sugar, and then I thought, no. Not this time. I'm not going to narrate my own defense to a man who watched it happen. Julian, I said, you were at the table, you don't need me to tell you what happened. You need to decide what you're going to do about what you saw. He didn't have an answer for that either, not that day. What happened next I didn't orchestrate, and I want to be clear about that. I wasn't trying to burn anything down on my way out. I was just done being the one who kept the peace. And it turns out that when you stop absorbing the tension in a family, the tension doesn't disappear. It has to go somewhere. It went to Julian first. For the first time in his adult life, he had to sit in a room with his mother without me there to make things smooth. And by every account I got secondhand, it did not go smoothly. He told her, apparently for the first time in 36 years, that hitting his wife at the dinner table was not something he was going to pretend hadn't happened. Delphine, who was used to being the one who set the terms of every family conversation, did not take that well. There was a fight, a real one, loud, the kind that had never happened in that house before, because I'd always been in the kitchen smoothing the edges off things before they got that far. It went to Priya next, in a quieter way. She called me about 2 weeks after, which surprised me, because Priya and I had never been close, not out of dislike, just out of the natural distance between the woman who serves and the woman who's served. She said she couldn't stop thinking about Ivy's face. She said she'd started replaying old dinners in her head, noticing for the first time that she'd never once gotten up to help me clear a table, never once seen me actually finish a meal while it was still hot. I didn't know, she told me, and I believed her, because I don't think she did. I didn't know because I never had to. She stopped going to Sunday dinners after that. Not as a statement, she said. She just couldn't sit at that table anymore without seeing it differently, and it went, eventually, to Delphine, though it took the longest to reach her, and I'm not sure it ever fully landed. The woman who had spent 30 years running a hospital wing, through sheer force of will found, for the first time, that her family was no longer arranging itself around her comfort automatically. Julian didn't bring the kids to see her for over a month. Priya stopped calling. The dinners that used to fill her dining room every Sunday thinned out to nothing, because it turned out I hadn't just been serving the food. I'd been the reason anyone showed up hungry enough to eat it together. Without me managing the machinery of that house, the house went quiet, and I think Delphine mistook that quiet for punishment, when really it was just the natural sound of a family no longer being held together by someone else's exhaustion. I didn't gloat about any of it. I want that to be clear. I didn't call Priya to hear more details, and I didn't ask Julian what his mother said when he confronted her. Somewhere around the 3rd week at my sister's, I stopped needing to know. That was its own kind of freedom, realizing I didn't need the family's reckoning to validate mine. Julian and I are still working things out. I won't pretend this ends with a bow on it. He came to my sister's house about 6 weeks after that dinner, sat on the porch steps, and said the truest thing he'd said to me in years. I let you disappear into that kitchen for a decade because it was easier than telling my mother no. That's on me, not you. It wasn't a full repair. But it was the first time in 10 years he'd taken responsibility for something, instead of just absorbing his mother's version of events. We're rebuilding, slowly, on different terms than before. Terms where nobody serves anybody else's plate before their own child has eaten, where Sunday dinners are optional, where tradition doesn't get to override 2 adults sitting down to eat their own food while it's still warm. I moved into a small rental 2 streets over from my sister. Close enough that Noah and Ivy could stay in their school district, small enough that I do all the cooking myself now, for exactly 3 people, and I always sit down first. People have asked me since that night whether I regret slapping her back, whether I wish I'd just walked away instead, been the bigger person, taken the higher road that women like me are always quietly expected to take. And I've thought about it a long time, and here's what I've landed on. I'm not proud of it exactly, but I'm not ashamed of it either. What I am is finally done confusing my own exhaustion for love. I spent 10 years believing that going last, eating cold food, disappearing into a kitchen so everyone else's evening could run smoothly. I believed that was what devotion looked like. It took my daughter's scream and my son's stunned little face to show me what it actually was. It was a woman slowly erasing herself, one Sunday at a time, and calling it grace. I'm not erasing myself anymore. My kids see their mother sit down at the table now, plate in front of her, before anyone else's second helping. And some nights when I watch them eat, Ivy's still folding her napkin into crooked little triangles. Noah quieter than he used to be but steadier too. I think that's the whole story right there. Not the slap, not the dinner. Just three people, sitting down together, nobody waiting their turn to be fed.